It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice right here, right now. You're joining us in our third segment this morning. We generally break our program into 4 segments, and you're joining us halfway through the program. Glad to have you on board. In this particular segment, we're going to talk about Verizon and VodaPhone and their connection to the NSA spying. And if you'd like to participate in the program, you can certainly give us a call. You can call us at 573-453-5505. We'll bring you on the air, and you can make your voice heard. You'll have to, you just have to give us a shout and let me bring you on board. Again, the phone number is 573-453-5505. Now, what's happening here with this Vodafone thing is that they have come out and stated that government agencies have been utilizing their cable connections to tap into phone conversations live and even track the locations of citizens, all without warrants, using secret cables that they've connected directly to the network equipment of Vodafone. Now, this is an article that came out in the Telegraph, and you say, well, why does this matter in the United States? Vodafone is a British company. Stop right there. Vodafone owned, until a month and a half or 2 months ago, 45% of Verizon. Hello. Now, Vodafone came out and said that this wasn't just in only Britain. This was in all 26 countries that they operate in. Hello? What does that tell you, folks? They say that secret wires have been connected to their network and those belonging to their competitors, giving government agencies the ability to tap into phone and broadband traffic. That includes your internet traffic. In many countries, this is mandatory for all telecom companies, and today they published the first law enforcement disclosure report. Now, you can find this article on telegraph.co.uk, and I encourage you, find it on our website. It's on our website at americasvoicenow.org. It's on our Facebook page at facebook.com/americasvoicenow, and you can also find it on patriotfb.com. This law enforcement disclosure report basically states that it describes exactly how the governments that it deals with in its 26 nations where it's offering service are eavesdropping on the citizens within those nations. It's calling for an end to the use of these direct access eavesdropping cables that are ported straight into the back of these network switches. And they're calling for transparency on the number of warrants that are issued to give access to private data. They operate, and I apologize, it's not 26, it's 29 countries, including the United States of America. I've never heard of Vodafone here in the United States, you say. Oh, I know you haven't. You know why? Because they own 45% of Verizon. Hello? Now, Verizon just announced 2 months ago, I think it was, or 3 months ago, that they were buying out Vodafone out of their 45% share. In other words, they were going to, buy Vodafone off, let Vodafone go, and become an independent, wholly owned subsidiary of Bell Atlantic Corporation or Verizon Corporation, right? I know this stuff because I used to work at Verizon and Bell Atlantic before it was Verizon and Bell Atlantic Mobile before. So the point is simply this. Vodafone owned 45% of Verizon Wireless up until a couple of months ago. So, and I can tell you, and I've already told you in the past, as a result of my time in the wireless business, that back in the early 90s, they passed something called CALEA. It was actually the late 90s, but it was called CALEA. CALEA stands for Communications and Law Enforcement Act. Communications Assistance Law Enforcement Act. I apologize. Now, essentially what that did is, at the time, law enforcement was furious about the fact that they could tap into landline phones, but they couldn't tap into wireless calls. Now, if you recall, and you were around in the late 90s when, mobile phones were just beginning to really kind of take off and the pricing was getting down to the point where average people could afford them, they recognized that there was this problem. These phones roamed all over the place, and so because they were portable and mobile, there was almost impossible to tap one. And so what they did is they passed this law called CALEA, Communications and Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And basically what it said is that every cellular telephone company, every wireless company, had to provide a big, gigantic plug into the back end of their switch. And in that plug went a law enforcement connection so that they could tap into not only... See, they couldn't tap into the air link between the phone and the cell tower. That was too much trouble and it was too hard. And it only let them hear one side of the conversation. So by tapping into the back of the switch, they were able to capture the entire conversation, and it didn't matter whether you were traveling locally or whether you were traveling, 10 states over and roaming on another carrier's network, because all the traffic still had to come back, at least for billing purposes. Now, they've gotten even more advanced because essentially by now having these fully nationalized networks that they have with like Verizon and AT&T and such like that, they have the ability when they tap in to even capture the roaming aspect. So, I mean, let's say you live in New York, but you're traveling in San Francisco, right? Well, the same carrier that you have in New York and San Francisco is in many cases going to be the same carrier you have in San Francisco. So by tapping into the switch, they get all of the conversation. They also get, of course, all of your GPS data, because every phone that's out there produced right now is what? These are phones that are produced by the carriers and by the manufacturers with the GPS chip in them. And if you have not recognized and you don't understand it or believe it at this point, the fault is in your stars, because they have the wherewithal and the ability to tap this phone, and not only that, but turn it on remotely when they want to use it as a microphone device. In addition to that, the NSA the NSA and the FBI and Vodafone, Verizon, and every other carrier, including AT&T and all the other competitors, they can all track your location by the GPS in this. And in addition to that, you've actually got police departments that are creating this fake network utilizing a cell site that actually pretends to be a cell site but really isn't. And when you drive past it, law enforcement agencies are putting this up. They get your entire contact list. They get all your texts. They get all your emails. They get all your messages. They get all the phone calls you make. For what? Where is that national security to sit there and set up one of these devices in, let's say, Pensacola, Florida, and catch every person who drives past it? How is that? I mean, what are we, all terrorists? Well, see, in their eyes, we are. And boom, there's the problem. You see, they consider you a threat, not because you actually have exhibited or given them any reason to believe that, just because you're not one of them. The truth is, this is top-down totalitarianism, and it's treason in the United States, at least, and it's tyranny globally. Vodafone Group's privacy officer, a guy by the name of Stephen Dedman, and I hate to say, I hope that's not indicative of what's going to happen to him based on the fact of his exposing this. He says, quote, "These pipes exist, and the direct access model exists. Quote, we are making a call to end direct access as a means of government agencies obtaining people's communication data. Without an official warrant, there is no external visibility. If we receive a demand, we can push back against the agency. The fact that a government has to issue a piece of paper is an important constraint on how these powers are used. We need to debate how are we balancing the need of law enforcement with the fundamental rights and freedoms of the citizens. The detail is we get a much more informed debate going, or the ideal, I apologize. The ideal is we get a much more informed debate going, and we do all of that without putting our colleagues in danger. Now, it was thought in the UK that a direct access pipe would be illegal. Alas, they've been using it anyway. And even where they're supposed to get warrants. Now, if you think that they're not doing that here, I've shown you time and time and time and time and time and time and time again, they are. And where the NSA is not doing it, because you say, well, President Obama assured us he wasn't listening in on our phone calls. That's true. He wasn't listening to every phone call, because the manpower to do that would be, you'd have to have a 1-for-1 for every person out there. So what they are doing, though, is taking and capturing all that, and then they convert it from speech into text, and then they can store the text indefinitely in a compressed state in your file. And if they ever have reason to suspect you for anything, they just bring up your file, and all of the texts are right there. And all your messages, and all your emails, and all your internet searches, and. And what the NSA cannot do, because they are prohibited by law from doing, and even they are afraid to crack that yet, or they haven't just been exposed for it yet, the FBI can do, because the FBI does have domestic authority. And we already know, and I did an entire program on this going back months, we already know that the NSA and the FBI have a direct linkage pipe between the two of them. So the FBI does what the NSA can't do and then feeds it to the NSA, who utilizes their computer systems to store it and analyze it. Please don't be so naive, people. Do you know how many in the United States, how many of the FISA court requests have been turned down in the last number of, 5-7 years? I've read this report a half a dozen times, and I'm sorry, I just don't have the numbers memorized in front of me. But I can tell you this. It's been none, so it doesn't make any difference whether it was 1 or 1 million, because they've not denied a single request. It's a rubber stamp, ladies and gentlemen, when they even bother to get one. Gus Hostein, he's the executive director of Privacy International. He says, while governments have starved this debate over surveillance by saying nothing and denying everything, wow, that's a telling statement, right? While governments have starved this debate over surveillance by saying nothing and denying everything, some companies have acted more responsibly by bringing data to the table. Vodafone is taking a commendable step by taking this issue on at an international scale. And they are trying to identify the legal basis for government's claimed powers. Here's a corporation that's openly telling you, your governments, not only here domestically in the United States, but in Europe and Britain, and this group operates in Egypt, in India, Qatar, Romania, South Africa, Turkey. That these groups and these organizations and these governments are claiming power. They're demanding power that doesn't really exist. They've not been given any authority. They're usurping and stealing it. He goes on to say that what we are now discovering is that the picture is even more bleak than previously thought. Governments around the world are unashamedly abusing privacy by demanding access to communications and data, and alarmingly, sometimes granting themselves direct access to the networks. Now that Vodafone has been more open, the entire industry has cover to take the necessary next steps of pushing back. Pushing back against bad requests is a start. Pushing back against bad law is the next step. It should start at home, as the UK continues to be a black mark on the global map of mass surveillance, with GCHQs tapping directly into Vodafone cables that carry our communications across the world. The usefulness of transparency reports hinges on governments abiding by the rule of law. We now know that these reports only provide a limited picture of what's going on. How do we know that this is out of control? Here, I'm going to show you. Did you know that the other day, and I posted this up on our Facebook page and website and blah, 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 blah. There's an article in Wired.com how the feds have seized the Stingray records and documents from Florida. U.S. Marshals seized the cops' spying records to keep them withheld from the ACLU based on a lawsuit. I mean, folks, this is open treason. Where do the federal marshals have the authority to go in there and snitch and steal records from a state, barring a court from saying, yeah, you got to turn them over? Who ever heard of such a thing? This is a constitutional crisis. The routine request in Florida for public records regarding the use of a surveillance tool known as a stingray took an extraordinary turn recently when federal authorities seized the documents before police could release them. The surprise move by the U.S. Marshal Service stunned the American Civil Liberties Union, which earlier this year filed a public record request with the Sarasota Police Department for information detailing the use on this controversial surveillance tool. The ACLU had an appointment last Tuesday to review the documents pertaining to a case investigated by a Sarasota police detective. The marshals, the federal U.S. Marshals, swooped in at the last minute to grab and seize the records, claiming they belong to the U.S. Marshals Service and barring the police from releasing them. Why? Because their argument is the DHS and the federal government paid for the stingray. People, don't you get it? This is so out of control. You cannot even begin to list the tyranny that's associated with this kind of an activity. And I don't care if they're doing an investigation on somebody. The truth of the matter is they're doing it and using illegal information to build a case. Look, if you're going to be Machiavellian about it and say the end justifies the means, then there is no rule of law. There's just a subjective claim of individuals who have an axe to grind, who utilize their authority and power and abuse it to do whatever it is that they want to do. You can't have it both ways, people. It can only work one way. Either we have a rule of law or we don't. Either we've got the sheriff of Nottingham who runs around doing as he pleases under the guise of some king who authorizes him to have whatever abusive power he wants, or we don't. ACLU staff attorney Nathan Freed Wessler called the move, quote, truly extraordinary and beyond the worst transparency violations that the group has seen regarding documents detailing police use of this technology. This is consistent with what we've seen around the country, with federal agencies trying to meddle with public requests for stingray information. He notes that the federal authorities have in other cases invoked the Homeland Security Act to prevent the release of these records. Quote, the feds are working very hard to block any release of this information to the public. You know why? Because they're spying on you. And they can't say it's national security if they're listening to Mrs. McGillicuddy from the local police department. Stingrays, also known as IMSI catchers, simulate a cell phone tower, and they trick the nearby mobile phones into connecting with them, which thereby reveals their location. A stingray can see and record a device's unique ID number and the traffic data, as well as information that points to its location. By moving a stingray around, authorities can triangulate a device's location with great precision, more so than is possible using data obtained from a carrier's fixed tower location. So they basically drive around with this thing. Don't you get it? And they can pinpoint your location down to, a couple of hundred yards, a couple of 100 feet. The records sought by the ACLU are important because the organization has learned that a Florida police detective obtained permission to use a stingray simply by filing an application with the court under Florida's trap and trace statute instead of obtaining a probable cause warrant. I invite you to reread the Fourth Amendment that demands that a warrant must be issued, stating explicitly what are you going to collect and from whom and where. Trap and trace orders generally are used to collect information from phone companies about telephone numbers received and called by a specific account. A stingray, however, can track the location, including inside private spaces, so they can tell you what floor you're on in the building. The government has long asserted it doesn't need a probable cause warrant to use a stingray because the device doesn't collect the content of phone calls and text messages, but instead operate like pen register and trap and trace, collecting the equivalent of all the header information, or metadata as it's called. The ACLU and others argue the devices are far more invasive than a trap and trace. Recently, a Tallahassee police department revealed that it used stingrays at least 200 times since 2010 and didn't even offer to tell a judge because the device manufacturer, wait until you hear this one, made the police department sign a non-disclosure agreement that police claim prevented them from disclosing use of the device to the court, even though the law says they have to. Ladies and gentlemen, who are we listening to? Harris Corporation, who says if you want to use this device, you've got to sign a non-disclosure that tells you you've got to violate the law, and you're going to give them absolute discretion for that? Are you flipping kidding me? In fact, Harris Corporation ought to be under federal criminal indictment right now. And the president and the entire executive staff under federal criminal indictment and state indictment. You know why? Because it's an incitement to commit a crime. You're telling a state, the Tallahassee Police Department, that they have an obligation to break the law to meet your civil requirement. And frankly, Tallahassee Police Department should have said, we're not going to sign a document that forces us to break the law. But they didn't. They agreed, and then gave the excuse to the judge, hey, we didn't have to tell you. We signed a non-disclosure that said we couldn't. Who's higher here? Harris Corporation and their lawyers, or a judge? The U.S. Marshals swept in here and seized these records from the Sarasota Police Department because they said they had deputized the detective. You got to be flipping kidding me. Ladies and gentlemen, it's like making the rules up as we go. Why are you taking those records? You're a federal agency. This is a state. Well, we have to. Okay, why? Because we deputized Bob there. I mean, you got to be kidding me. Is this a Keystone Cop circus, or is this the United States of America? We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Bergdahl Gitmo release and the implications for the country. I tell you, folks, I got to tell you, we have gone so far over the cliff. I mean, we're not even like the little cartoon creature that just spins there in midair anymore, waiting to fall. We've already fallen. Now we're just waiting for the splat at the bottom. Find us at americasvoicenow.org. You can email me at mike@americasvoicenow. That's mike@americasvoicenow.org. We'll be right back.